Hey everybody, this is section 2. Wait, hold on. I feel like I didn't press record. God damn it. Oh God. I should take myself more seriously, shouldn't I? Especially considering the subject matters that I discuss, but you know, I can't be bothered. And that's a disgusting way to start. This is a fucking hilarious video. Alright. This is section 2 of this is section 2 of chapter 1 of Marx Worldwide on the development of international discourse on Marx since 1965. Section 2 is titled Marxism's Resurgence, between the inception and high point of political movements of emancipation, circa 1960/65 to 77. So here we go. There was a specifically international dimension to the political revolts of the 1960s. The Vietnam War, the Japanese movement against the security treaty between the USA and Japan in 1960, and again in 1970, the ever-advancing development of the Cuban Revolution, the Latin American guerrilla movements in the countryside as well as in the cities, the U.S. movement against the Vietnam War, the Indian Naxalite insurgency, the student movements in Mexico, West Germany, Japan, Spain, and numerous other countries in the second half of the 1960s, May 1968 in Paris, the strike wave of the, quote, hot autumn in Italy. These were all political events or movements that had an international discursive resonance, and in some cases they became important sources of political inspiration across national borders. The specifically international dimension of the political revolts of the 1960s should not be presented as a historical novelty, however, since the transmission of revolutionary influences and ideas across national borders has occurred previously in history. One need only think of the international revolutionary events of 1848 to 49 or 1917 to 1919. Yet the revolts of the 1960s transcended not only national boundaries, but also to a greater extent continual ones. The revolts of the 1960s were bound up with a growing interest in an intensive engagement with Marxian theory. At the same time as the political revolts were occurring, there was a developing wave of appropriation of Marxian theory, especially of his critique of political economy. This later process also had an international character. They developed a lively transfer of theories and interpretations beyond linguistic and national boundaries. In the words of Milos Nikolic, quote, the new wave of dissemination of Marxism and its more intensive political and theoretical reaffirmation began, in the early 1960s. This wave brought a reaffirmation of Marxism in West Germany. It spread Marxism for the first time in Great Britain and the USA. It advanced Marxist theory in Latin America and took the first significant steps in the development of Marxism in Africa, end quote. Nikolic adds that Marxism was able to anchor itself in the academic sphere in the 1960s. A critical qualification ought to be made here in relation to Nikolic's account. The international wave of Marxism that he sketches cannot actually be so precisely dated. It would be more accurate to say that it did not develop simultaneously in all countries. In Japan, for example, this had already occurred in the 1950s. According to Nikolic, an important moment in the development of this post-war Marxism was the initiation of a process of revision and supersession in relation to the Marxism of the Third International. Nikolic writes that this process, which has been described as a renaissance of Marxism, began with a return to Marx's original text. Within the time frame thematized here, circa 1960/65 to 77, there was thus a burgeoning interest in Marxism as a critical social theory. This was the case on an international scale. In the following historical exposition, it should be borne in mind that it will be necessary time and again to consider individual theorists in whose thinking currents or of ideas or political events were reflected, and to refer to intellectuals from all over the world whose thinking accompanied processes of development both in the political sphere and within the history of ideas. Section 1 of Section 2 of Chapter 1. Western Europe and the Anglo-Saxon world. In West Germany, there was at first little indication of a renaissance of Marx-oriented thought in the early 1960s. The KPD, Kommunistische Partei Deutschlands, had been proscribed in 1956, and this SPD, Sozialdemokratische Partei Deutschlands, had renounced its last points of reference to Marxism in its Godesberg program of 1959. Yet in West Germany there was a few lone intellectuals who at least endeavored to ensure that interest in Marxian and Marxist theory was sustained. In this context, it would be appropriate to mention Leo Koffler, but also the political scientist Irving Fetcher, and not least a philosopher coming from the tradition of critical theory, namely Alfred Schmidt. And I obviously have books by Alfred Schmidt on the channel and Irving Fetcher. I have one single piece by Christoph Juncker, wrote a book or edited a volume of works by Leo Koffler. And I looked at the part that was kind of about, I think it was about Koffler's relationship to like Stalinism, to the Soviet Union. And he was kind of like a reform communist, and then became kind of like throughout the 60s and 70s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, I think, I don't know when he died, became more of like a, more like staunchly Soviet. Whereas in the past, he was more of like a reform communist. In fact, I got from that essay the term reform communist, that piece. I think that's I think Christoph Juncker really found a good word there to describe something. Okay. So, where am I? Yet in West Germany, where the hell am I? But yeah, so I have some piece on Koffler. I have Irving Fetcher's book, which I believe is titled Marx and Marxism, and Alfred Schmidt's book. Which one was it? It was something like history and structure or something like that. But yeah, so check that out. In the 1960s, the SDS, Sozialistische Deutsche Studentenbund, which is not, so obviously SDS has the same acronym, but not, I don't know, would you still call it, I don't know, but anyway, it wasn't the same as in the United States. It's not Students for a Democratic Society. Or I guess it's German Socialist Student Bund, Student League, German Socialist Student League, I guess is what it translates as. That's my guess. Anyway, in the 1960s, the SDS, Sozialistische Deutsche Studentenbund, underwent a process of political radicalization, including in West Berlin and Frankfurt, the bastions of the student movement. This movement experienced its high point in 1968. This political process was accompanied by a burgeoning interest in theoretical engagement with Marx. In 1966, Rudi Dutschke compiled a kind of Marxist literary canon in order to provide his comrades with a guide for a renewed understanding of the emergence, development, and reception of Marxist theory. Oh, yeah, no, it says right here, sorry, there's a footnote. It says, the Socialist German Student Federation. I just always thought Bund meant league, but I'm not sure. Anyway. The theoretical horizon of a determinate part of the Berlin SDS can be inferred from this canon. Footnote. The theoretical protagonist of an earlier generation of the West Berlin SDS was Michał Malka. Malka died in 1966. Must have been a young fellow. And footnote. And in this regard, it is striking that according to Dutschke's understanding of Marxism, quote, the attempt to, quote, reestablish Marxism through an unmediated and direct recourse to the, quote, pure Marx, end quote, misconstrues, quote, the essence and method of Marx, end quote. Dutschke. Indeed, the reception of Marx within the SDS, not only in Britain but also in Frankfurt, was undertaken in both a direct and a mediated way. The latter approach was characterized by a critical engagement with thinkers inspired by Marx, in particular with Karl Korsch. But Georg Lukács and Herbert Marcuse were likewise read and discussed in both Frankfurt and Berlin. Footnote, students from the milieu around the SDS also sought to personal contact with Lukács. In this connection, there was also a 1967 letter by Dutschke to Lukács, which was published by Frieder Otto Wolff, on the famous encounter between Marcuse and students in the main auditorium of the Free University of Berlin in the summer of 1967. End footnote. The most significant theorist of the Frankfurt SDS was Hans-Jürgen Krahl. According to research into the SDS, quote, there had already been a reception of the Frankfurt School by the other groups within the SDS beyond the Frankfurt group toward the end of the 1950s, end quote. Becker. However, the theoretical influence of the Frankfurt School was especially present in the Frankfurt group of the SDS. Krahl was personally a student of Theodor W. Adorno. During the course of the student movement, Krahl chose to ignore Adorno's reservations with regard to revolt, but his theory did not lose its Adornian stamp. One of the things that I feel like Krahl, this is the problem with fucking theory, right? I think this is a problem with like high theories. So for instance, maybe like this book, and also and just like generally like the Frankfurt School critical theory, or like whatever other types of critical theories there may be that are like kind of like on the academic level, is that they don't ground themselves sufficiently, in my view, in like I guess the more like street level or like more directly political tendencies and the history of them, and assessing that and like aligning oneself in some loose way or not with them. I think that so like people like I think, to my understanding, at least like Krahl was like pretty interested. I get this impression that he's pretty interested in like third worldism, like fucking Ho Chi Minh, or like maybe like Kwame Nkrumah or something like that. I think that's how you pronounce his name. So like a way more, very like a lot of people in the 60s, influenced by the decolonization movement in the 1950s and 1960s, in the post-war era. And kind of like pretty uncritically so, to my understanding. I mean, he died young. Which is something that he wouldn't be able to do, like, which is something that Adorno, to my understanding, was way more skeptical of, about like the emancipatory potential of like nationalist developmentalism. Not that he was like against it in some capacity, in the sense of like, oh yeah, just, I don't know, it didn't seem like he was like, I don't know. I don't want to say what Adorno thinks, I don't fucking know. But it does seem like there is kind of an influence on the older generation of the Frankfurt School, and this is just something I'm speculating on, and I think there's some evidence for this. They were influenced by like the politics of critical Marxism from the 1920s and 1930s, in a way that the student movement didn't seem to appear to have too much connection to, right? So like, for instance, like I think there was some influence and relationship. There's a piece by a guy, and I think it's Felix Baum, in the Frankfurt Sage Handbook of Frankfurt School Critical Theory, who has an article about Frankfurt School Critical Theory and Council Communism. So there's the Council Communist influence, so the critique of state socialism very early on. There's some kind of relationship between Council Communism as like a political tendency in the Frankfurt School in the 30s, or like the 20s, and I don't know, the early people who, it seemed like there's some kind of relationship to the Council Communism and Frankfurt School. I don't remember the exact relationship, but also I think there's, even though what was really important for the Frankfurt School, right, was the experience of National Socialism, right, and that being kind of like a very like important phenomenon that kind of oriented large parts of the theoretical like orientation and their theoretical interests. So they didn't particularly talk about, it didn't seem like, from my understanding, like I've read a lot of the secondary literature on the Frankfurt School. I don't really see much about them talking about the Soviet bloc too much. However, I think there is a quote from Adorno to the effect that his understanding of the Eastern Bloc was influenced by Trotsky's "The Revolution Betrayed." I don't have that quote on me, and I might be making that quote up, so don't. I'm not particularly confident in that statement. I could be telling a lie right now, but I'm pretty sure that he had. So there's like an influence on the Frankfurt School to some extent of like critical Marxism on like the political level, not just on like the theoretical level of like, you know, like Lukács or something like that. And I think that influence would make them, it made them way more skeptical of anything Soviet or Marxist-Leninist. Not just on the theoretical level of like, you know, being opposed to like dogmatic dialectical materialism, but also to like the politics in which that ideology emerged. Whereas the student movement seemed like, or maybe I'm wrong, I mean the student movement, that's too fucking broad. But it seems like there are at least parts of the student movement, and eventually this comes to be when they all become Stalinist, a lot of them become Stalinist in the forms of like third worldist Maoism. Not really too much critical not insufficiently critical distance from the Soviet and Stalinist experience, which is like why like that doesn't seem like, you know, when you're just talking about. So it seems like you can just like, oh yeah, I like Adorno, and then think a million different things about this, that, or the other thing, because you have no kind of like, you're not connecting your theoretical, the theoretical level with the more direct, immediate, or like the more concrete, like political level of like the various like socialist tendencies. So you can just be kind of like, I don't know. Like it seems like it wasn't just skepticism about like the student movement. It seemed like Kroll was not skeptical at all about, I don't know, Vietnamese Stalinism, for instance. Even if obviously, you know, like everyone, he would be opposed to the Vietnam War, like as most people were, whether they were Stalinist or not, obviously, for humane reasons, if for no other reason. So they were like, what was I gonna say? But there was just there kind of seems like some kind of like disconnect, because there was like the Frankfurt School being your point of reference doesn't really seem to like get you sufficiently deep into any particular socialist tendency, which I think is a problem. And a lot of the people that are like the best, I think, in critical theory actually do align themselves with some kind of tradition that like is not always frequently addressed. So for instance, like Werner Bonefeld and say like John Holloway, for instance, are very much of like the of council communist influence, right? It's very much something that they would like, or Pannekoek and like those kinds of people, they would definitely. That's who they politically align with. Whereas opposed to like other people kind of like, oh yeah, I like Adorno, but like, you know, or like I like the Frankfurt School, but not really having kind of too many opinions about, or at least having contradictory opinions about the, I don't know, more concrete socialist tendencies. Not that you have to think anything because you think something else. You don't have to be like, oh yeah, I think this, therefore I think this other thing. Like, you know, there's obviously creative and thoughtful ways that need thinking out and like, you know, reasoning. You need to reason these connections that you make between the higher theoretical terrain and your political alignments. But you should be making them. So it seems like, basically, I'm sorry, I'm going on this whole thing. I'm very lonely, so you have to listen to me. It seems like there's very much a there actually is like a political difference between Krall and Adorno about like the world situation, which is important. Not just Adorno being stuffy or like cowardly or something like that, or nervous or pessimistic or something like that. There's like actual like, there seems to be like a difference between Krall and Adorno, and especially Horkheimer, who's kind of more, seems way more committed to just like the post-war liberal order as like the best of all possible worlds for the foreseeable future, to my understanding. Maybe I'm wrong. Anyway, Jesus Christ, I'm so sorry for that. No one wants to hear that shit. I was just thinking, where the hell am I? Indeed, the reception of Marx within the SDS, not only in Berlin but also in Frankfurt, was undertaken in both a direct and mediated way. The latter approach was characterized by a critical engagement with thinkers inspired by Marx, in particular with Karl Korsch, but Georg Lukács and Herbert Marcuse were likewise read and discussed in both Frankfurt and Berlin. I think that's... I'm reading. I think Korsch is like a fascinating and a very important figure in this. Who obviously, for him, for instance, he went on to become council communist. Unlike Lukács, who kind of recanted a lot of his best work in order to be in more conformity with the mainstream communist movement. Anyway. Like he might not have theoretically been a Stalinist, but he was politically a Stalinist. It seems very much the case to me. Fuck, I keep getting sidetracked. The most significant theorist of the Frankfurt SDS was Hans-Jürgen Krall. According to research into the SDS, quote, there had already been a reception of the Frankfurt School by other groups within the SDS beyond the Frankfurt group towards the end of the 1950s, end quote. Becker. However, the theoretical influence of the Frankfurt School was especially present in the Frankfurt group of the SDS. Krall was personally a student of Theodor W. Adorno. During the course of the student revolt, Krall chose to ignore Adorno's reservations with regard to the revolt, but his theory did not lose its Adornian stamp. Shortly after Adorno's death, Krall paid tribute to his mentor, whose, quote, micrological power of exposition, end quote, had brought to light the, quote, submerged emancipatory dimension of Marx's critique of political economy, the self-conscious character of which is a revolutionary theory, and thus is a doctrine whose propositions construe society from the perspective of its radical transformation, is mostly lost on contemporary Marxist economic theorists, end quote. Krall. According to Krall, Adorno's legacy was the transmission of the consciousness of emancipation characteristic of Western Marxism of the interwar period. There was specific reference to the categories of reification, fetishization, reification, fetishization, mystification, and second nature. Adorno's intervention against the invocation of a unity of theory and practice, a postulate which is characteristic of Marxism-Leninism, was nothing if not consistent, given the position he had taken. Already in the book Negative Dialectics, which of course is on this channel, which was written before the student movement, he had criticized a corresponding conception, quote, the demand for the unity of theory and praxis has irresistibly debased the former to a mere underling, eliminating from it what it was supposed to have achieved in that unity. The practical visa stamp demanded from all theory became the stamp of the censor. In the famed unity of theory praxis, theory was vanquished and praxis became non-conceptual, a piece of the politics which it was supposed to lead beyond, delivered over to power, end quote. Adorno, Negative Dialectics. Significantly, it was precisely Adorno's student, Krall, who despite his political engagement opposed potential tendencies inimical to theory within the student movement. Footnote. Detlef Clausen, regards Krall as being considerably influenced by Adorno's social critique and characterizes him as a protagonist of the, quote, third generation of critical theory, whose contribution in the course of the student movement also consisted precisely in the articulation of, quote, opposition to tendencies in the movement which were inimical to theory and thus to emancipation, end quote. Detlef Clausen. End footnote. Krall engaged intensively with Marx's critique of political economy. Hans-Georg Backhaus, who studied alongside Krall under Adorno in the 1960s and was subsequently a pioneer of the New Marx reading in the Federal Republic of Germany, maintains that it was his, Backhaus's, own engagement with Marx's critique of political economy that spurred Krall to, quote, turn his attention to the text on Marx's value theory, with he was unfamiliar at the time, end quote. Backhaus, 1997. Footnote. It should be borne in mind that Backhaus is somewhat critical towards Krall in his retrospective view of the latter. Backhaus asserts that the title of Krall's famous essay, titled On the Essence, Logic in Marx's Commodity Analysis, is, quote, misleading. In Krall's essay, there is by no means any essence logical concretization of the commodity analysis, pointing beyond what I have set out in relation to the category of doubling, bracket, Verdoppelung, end bracket, for instance, vis-a-vis the problem of the commodity as, quote, immediate contradiction, end quote. The title was presumably added by Krall's editors. Krall merely repeats in various formulations the category of, quote, doubling, Verdoppelung. By contrast, it is rather his essay Bemerkungen zum Verhältnis von Kapital und Hegelscher Wesenlogik, or which translates as Observation on the Relation Between Capital and Hegel's Logic of Essence, that represents a step forwards, with the almost simultaneous elaboration of the same problem by Helmut Reichelt, and with certain reservations by Klaus Hartmann, was far more rigorous. The function of the, quote, dialectical exposition, end quote, completely escaped Krall, end quote. Backhaus. End footnote. Within the German language debate, Krall figures as the protagonist of a, quote, Hegelianizing interpretation of the Marxian critique of political economy. Thus he states the following, quote, the transfer of categories of Hegelian logic, these have been extracted from their metaphysical context, to the categories of political economy, is, according to Marx, that which defines the critique of political economy. In Marx's view, Hegelian logic is the self-movement of capital dressed in metaphysical garb, end quote. Accordingly, the subsequent critique of, quote, Hegelian Marxism was directed against Krall in particular. Footnote. Michael Heinrich makes the following criticism of Krall, quote, such a transfer, bracket, as the one referred to by Krall in the above quotation, in bracket, does not correspond to Marx's own self-understanding. Above all, however, Hegelian philosophy itself precludes such a procedure. Thus, the proposition that the specific form of Marx's exposition is to be sought in Hegel's logic presupposes something that is assumed by all Hegelian Marxist authors without giving grounds for such an assumption, that it is at all possible to separate out the figures of argumentation of Hegelian logic from their speculative premises without destroying them in the process. Hegel's logical categories, however, are precisely not mere forms that were applied to a content distinct from them, and that could therefore be applied to any given content. End quote. Heinrich, 1986. End footnote. Between 1968 and 1969, the fractional tensions within the SDS became increasingly intense. The organization was finally dissolved in 1970 following the death of Hans-Jürgen Krall in an accident. In the meantime, the student movement had left an important legacy in the FRG, West Germany, a completely novel kind of intense and widespread interest in an engagement with Marx's work in general and with his critique of political economy in particular. This interest was sustained into the second half of the 1970s. Footnote. George Katsiafakis, an American writer whose focus on the international dimension of the protest events of 1968 states the following, quote, "The German New Left was among the most theoretically inclined members of the global movement," end quote. Castiophicus. Incidentally, contact with the student movement of the 1960s coincided with a heightened interest in Marx and Marxist theory within the milieu around the West Berlin journal Das Argument. There's a journal that's called the Argument in French, so I was mistaking that, sorry. Das Argument, which itself had its origins in the anti-nuclear movement of the 1950s. Wolfgang Fritz Haug comments as follows, quote, "By the time the student movement had become a mass movement, the group around Das Argument had already crossed the threshold to Marxism," end quote. Wolfgang Fritz Haug. The study of Marx's Capital was significant in this process. In 1972, Haug, the editor of Das Argument, insisted on what he presumed to be the internal connection between the critique of political economy and Marxian socialism. End footnote. Side note, Wolfgang Fritz Haug, to my understanding, my understanding of him is pretty limited, but I think he seems more, even if he comes from the student movement, he seems very much more of like a traditional, to my understanding at least, pretty traditional interpretations of Marxism. Whatever traditional means, in the sense of like not particularly Soviet critical, or particularly critical of like the positivist reception of Marxism. Maybe I'm talking out my ass, but what is certainly true is that he does not, to my understanding, he accepts a naturalist or what Heinrich calls like a substantialist interpretation of Marx's value theory. Kind of in a certain sense like naturalizes value, and doesn't really thinks that like abstract labor is like an actually means like labor as such, as opposed to a socially particular type of labor that's necessarily that valorizes, adds value, creates new commodities with augmented value. Getting off track here, but I have a piece on here by Werner Bonefeld that's like a pretty it seems like a very good critique what's the word? Critiques this substantialist interpretation of Marx's critique of political economy and its defense by Haug. So that's what I was saying. Anywho, moving on. In Italy, the situation in the post-war period was considerably different from that in West Germany. For in contrast to the KPD, which was proscribed in 1956, the PCI, Partito Comunista Italiano, remained an influential mass party in the 1950s and 1960s. Two dimensions were initially of particular importance in relation to the context within which Marx and Marxism-related theory was formed, i.e. the context defined by the tension between politics and science. First, the emergence of a political line that was partially independent vis-a-vis Moscow, and that was especially connected to the activity of Palmiro Togliatti. Second, the renewed interest in the philosopher Galvano della Volpe, lived from 1895 to 1968, was able to arouse an intensive engagement with Marxian theory and with Marx's original text. Under Togliatti, the PCI of the post-war period pursued a new path that was to lead to socialism via, quote, structural reforms. Such that the programmatic orientation of revolution slipped into the background. At the 8th Congress of the PCI in 1956, Togliatti had already anticipated a thesis of an independent Italian path to socialism, i.e. independent vis-a-vis Moscow. On a theoretical level, it was above all the theoretical interpretation of Della Volpe that provided a central impetus. Here it can be noted that the influence of Della Volpe in inspiring the formation of a school of thought gradually became evident over the course of the 1950s and 1960s. Lucio Coletti has suggested that Della Volpe's standing within the PCI was temporarily boosted due to the fact that he remained in the party at a time when many intellectuals had turned their backs on it in the wake of the international events of 1956. And that's just generally a thing. The invasion of Hungary in 1956, Khrushchev's secret speech, caused a big, disorientation in international communism. Led to a lot of things, led to a lot of people leaving the parties, kind of set the stage a little bit, amongst other things, for the Sino-Soviet split. That's when a lot of people start becoming either drop out of mainstream communism for something else, or I guess with the development of the Sino-Soviet split, people committed Stalinists basically become Maoists in the early 1960s. That's my understanding of it. And I think that's a defensible position as well. Whatever people may think about, the populist grassroots pretensions of Maoism. Where the hell am I? Lucio Coletti has suggested that Della Volpe's standing within the... Where am I? At the beginning of the 1960s, there were reproaches within the party of fraction building around the Della Volpe school. The second part of this study will focus more closely on the Della Volpe school. Around the beginning of the 1960s, a new political and theoretical current emerged in Italy and evolved its own grasp of Marxian theory independently of, quote, academic Marxism. As a result, there is a distinction to be made in relation to the Italian engagement with Marx's critique of political economy between, on the one side, a theoretical current oriented to the theory of struggle and more strongly geared toward political and revolutionary praxis, and on the other, the more markedly, quote, academic debate around Marx. According to Giacomo Maramau, the distinction between, quote, academic and, quote, militant Marxism was at its sharpest in Italy in the second half of the 1960s. Within this context, the so-called apparismo of the 1960s is of special relevance. This was a revolutionary communist movement which originated in Italy and had its greatest effect there, but its influence certainly radiated outward to other countries. Footnote. On the reception, there's two footnotes. Footnote. A literal English translation of apparismo would be, quote, workerism, although this term is tended to have a different pejorative connotation in English language Marxist discourse. End footnote. Footnote. On the reception of Italian apparismo by parts of the West German left of the 1960s, see Ebbinghaus, 2003. Real quick, I just want to see who this Ebbinghaus is. Angelica Ebbinghaus. Okay, so this piece that's being referred to is from an edited journal called Fluchtpunkte das soziale Gedächtnis der Arbeiterbewegung in den 1970s Jahren. That's the, or semi, I fucked that up. Fluchtpunkte das soziale Gedächtnis der Arbeiterbewegung, edited by Arno Kuhne, Karl A. Otto, and Karl Heinz Roth. If you don't know, I'm not sure if, I think Angelica Ebbinghaus, Angelica Ebbinghaus, where am I? Ebbinghaus, I don't know about these other authors who edited this volume, but they're affiliated with Wildcat Germany, which is kind of like a apparismo or influence, like workerist-y kind of group. I think they're kind of affiliated with like angry workers world, or the angry workers of the world. I can't remember what it's called. And you see you see their work on like LibCom, but you also see it on Eve Coleman, who's producing some of the best work in the game right now, in my opinion, on a whole range of topics, especially on nationalism. But anyway, and I think that Ebbinghaus and Karl-Heinz Roth are of that, we might call it German Abarismo. That text that Ebbinghaus is writing is not just a merely academic study; it's kind of more personal. But the thing that I wanted to say is that in the German reception of Abarismo, and I'm getting this from Karl-Heinz Roth, edited like a compendium. I don't know. They have this thing. I can't remember what the hell it's called. But in Germany, there's like this thing of like edited volumes being dedicated to like I'm sure this happens in other things, but like edited volumes dedicated to like a living humanities scholar. Once they reach like a certain age, like usually like in their like 60s or something like that, they have like compendium for like, I don't know, like the Johannes Agnoli, for instance, or other people like that, right? But he made edited one that's with the historical materialism book series for the great scholar Marcel van der Linden, who wrote Western Marxism in the Soviet Union, a tremendous book of like such breadth and depth and such a concise volume. Everyone has to read that book. Put a gun to your head and make you read it. Anyway, but in that piece, in that book, Karl-Heinz Roth talks about how whereas like the Italian Aperismo had more of like an ambivalent attitude to the USSR, the German reception of it was like firmly like anti-Leninist. Definitely, it was way more of like a council communist orientation, and obviously, like that's why people within like libertarian leftism, obviously, it's very much about like direct worker confrontation with management at sites of production and in society at large. Very much about like very emphasis on class struggle and contestation. So obviously, it would appeal to people who are obviously more oriented towards like direct action and stuff like that. But that kind of like tendency within Italian Aperismo was really emphasized by the German reception of it, which definitely has more of like I don't know what the word called. They'd probably be mad by any word I use, but definitely like a libertarian, anti-statist kind of orientation. Which Roth criticizes Marcel van der Linden for not discussing in his book of Western Marxism, not looking at any of the analyses of for instance, of Wildcat of the USSR, which apparently there are. And a lot of people obviously have published in Wildcat Germany of various not various political persuasions, but like various authors, like Riccardo Bellafiore, I know has pieces there. Maybe Michal Heinrich, I'm not sure. But like Riccardo Bellafiore, I think he's very influenced by Neue Marx-Lektüre, but is also kind of influenced to some extent, or at least politically influenced to some extent by Aperismo. Like he wrote the book, he and Massimiliano, I think that's how you say his name, Tomba, wrote the introduction for Storming Heaven by Stephen Wright, which is about the history of Aperismo. I'm just thinking out loud to myself basically right now about what, about the connections here. Filling in the blanks that I can. Maybe you find it interesting, maybe you don't. Where the hell am I? Politically, the operaist movement stood in contrast to the established workers' organizations for resolute struggle against labor in which the comparatively new figure of the, quote, mass worker served as an important reference point. Footnote. For a detailed account of the history, and especially the history of the theory of apparismo, see Stephen Wright, 2002. That's the book I was talking about, Storming Heaven, which I read a long time ago. In footnote. The journal Quaderni Rossi, founded by Raniero Pansieri, played an important role in the development of operaista theory. I have a piece by Raniero Pansieri on this channel, which is about the capitalist, I think it's titled The Capitalist Use of Machinery. Claudio Pazzoli describes the engagement with Marx's work as being central for the theorists in the milieu around this journal. I'm not sure who Claudio Pazzoli is, but I see his name on like a lot of sick books that are from that are in Italian, but that are kind of about like critical Marxism. In this process, the critique of political economy became a decisive point of reference, according to Pazzoli. He writes that the, quote, interpretive categories for an analysis of Italian society with revolutionary intent were taken from Marx's Capital and the Grundrisse, end quote. Claudio Pazzoli. Between 1963 and 1964, following a split in the group around Quaderni Rossi, a new journal, Classe Operaia, came into existence with the collaboration of Mario Tronti, who had contributed to Quaderni Rossi. Within Apparismo, it was in particular these two thinkers, i.e. Tronti and Pansieri, the latter died in 1964, who stood for an intensive engagement with Marx's critique of political economy. And I have a piece, I can't remember the precise title of it, by Tronti on this channel, like his big piece on critique of political economy. Tronti sought to appropriate Marxist thought from a revolutionary class standpoint. The labor theory of value cannot be separated from the political, according to Tronti. Quote, for Marx, labor value is a political thesis, a revolutionary watchword. It is neither an economic law nor a means for the scientific interpretation of social phenomena, or better, it contains these two latter determinations, but on the foundation of the first as its consequence, end quote. Tronti. And obviously, it says, footnote, in English language edition of Tronti's work, Operai e Capitale, which is like Workers and Capital, is forthcoming, which is it's already been this book's from a while ago, but that book has been translated. I think it's with Verso, but that's where I read the piece from Tronti from. Anywho, Tronti elaborates on this point by asserting that labor is the measure of value, quote, because the working class is a condition for capital. Because the working class is a condition for capital. This political conclusion is the true presupposed starting point of Marx's economic analysis itself, end quote. Tronti. In the 1970s, the Operaista movement would undergo a further process of political and theoretical development in which the reference to Marxian theory was of fundamental significance. The events of May 1968 in France can be considered, perhaps alongside the Italian hot autumn of 1969, as the high point of the revolts in Western Europe. And here it should be noted that in France and Italy, these revolts were not merely student rebellions, but also workers' insurgencies. The May events themselves and the first years thereafter were characterized by the rising strength of Trotskyist and Maoist groupings. On a theoretical and political level, the quote, internal French, end quote, development of the discussion around Marxian and Marxist theory was of more significance than external influences on the reception of Marxism in France. While the Communist Party of France had opposed any thoroughgoing de-Stalinisation, to an extent even after 1956, a broad and heterogeneous field of emancipatory philosophy and social theory had already evolved in France before May 1968, in which Marx sometimes represented an important point of reference. Footnote. This field comprises, among others, the Marxist philosopher Lucien Goldman, the situationist Guy Debord, the Argument group, non- or anti-Marxist intellectuals, non- or anti-Marxist anarcho-socialist Cornelius Castoriadis, Jean-Paul Sartre, the sociologist and Marx researcher Henri Lefebvre, who was expelled from the PCF in 1958, as well as the, quote, Marxologist Maximilien Rubel. There's an article by Bruno Bongiovanni on Maximilien Rubel that I haven't read yet, but I'd really like to, because, and there's also, like, I think a good obituary of Maximilien Rubel by the Dunayevskyian Marxist humanist Kevin B. Anderson on the internet somewhere, that I think is probably very good. His work, obviously, Kevin B. Anderson's work is very good. But check out I definitely have works on this. Check out the book that I have on here. I probably need to make a playlist of it, but if you go through the videos and stuff, you can find it. But I have a book by Anselm Jaffe, who's like kind of like the crisis, Robert Kurtz, exit orientation, influenced by Moïse Paston, among others. I have a book by him about Guy Debord, which is a tremendous book, not only on the level of just like talking about Debord's theory, but also kind of like it's very suggestive for like it's kind of an interest. It seems to me, at least, it seemed like an interesting book theoretically in its own right. That was my impression of it when I read it, and it's very good. And I haven't listened to all the videos of it, but recordings I have of me reading it, but it's very good. The Argument group, also, this is kind of, I could say this with two things. There's a book on this channel, two books on this channel. Let me say. The Argument group, the non- or anti-Marxist, quote, anarcho-socialist Cornelius Castoriadis. In reference to both of them, I have two great books on this channel by Christos Mamos, who's written good things. I also have a piece on him about the relationship between anarchism and council communism in like the 1920s. I don't really know too much about his biography or anything like that, but he has written two books on this channel that I thought were tremendous. One is his book on Cornelius Castoriadis, which I don't remember what it's called, but it's Christos Mamos is the name, and also the book on open Marxism, which includes Castoriadis in that kind of like cluster of people, even though Castoriadis is kind of falls beyond the scope of that to some extent. Obviously, he declares himself not a Marxist. But that book also includes the Argument group, who kind of coined the term, what's his name? Kostas Axelos, who, like Castoriadis, was a Greek expatriate in France. So if you're interested in learning more about Argument and Castoriadis, check out the work by Christos Mamos that's on this channel. Also, in addition, I don't know if I'll have this book. I don't know what the order of videos me going up will be, but particularly on the Argument group, check out the book by Mark Poster, which is titled Existential Marxism in Post-War France, which will be on this channel, which goes extensively into the relationship between Argument and particularly Kostas Axelos and his relationship to the thought of Sartre and also like Heidegger, kind of trying to create like some kind of synthesis, some kind of Heideggerian influenced Marxism. And I think like Argument, I think the term itself, open Marxism, comes from the Argument journal in France. So check that out. And in addition, that's books generally, I would say that Mark Poster book is generally about Jean-Paul Sartre and his kind of relation to Marxism from, the 1940s to his death. Or like, it wasn't to his death, but to like late in his life. I think I think Sartre died in 1980. I think the book that I'm speaking of was published in 1975. But kind of talking about Sartre's relationship to like USSR, the broader left in France, and particularly the French Communist Party, and kind of like it's a very rich intellectual history. Anyway, I do go on. But those are some things you might want to check out if you're interested in these topics on this channel. Prior to 1968, there already existed an intellectual atmosphere in which various tendencies within French Marxism direct their efforts towards a new appropriation, liberated from any dogmatism of Marxian theory in general and capital in particular. Just as a side note, I want to keep. This is something that, in reading about these tendencies, is that a lot of people, and this is obviously is not what Jan Hoff is doing here, but kind of mean Stalinism. When they say Stalinism, they almost mean it as like a philosophical system, which is like very dubious. Obviously, there is like a dogmatic Soviet philosophy, which I have pieces on this channel. Check out the work by Gustav A. Vetter and also Z.A. Jordan on this topic, in addition to James D. White, I think his name is. But they kind of like talk about Stalinism almost as if it's just like a politics, or like not even politics, but like a theoretical frame of reference, right? So if someone disagrees with certain tenets of Soviet dogmatic philosophy, they're suddenly not a Stalinist anymore, and that's not the case. I don't think you can say that. Like, I think that like Althusser, for instance, and even Sartre in various phases of his life, definitely were people who were, their critiques of Stalinism were very limited, to say the least, if they existed at all, to the extent that they existed, I mean. But they definitely, the inclusion of things like existentialism into Marxist conversation, but also like things like psychoanalysis, which was shunned in like the USSR, or structuralism, or any of these kind of any developments in the philosophical and the humanities and social sciences, the incorporation of those things were definitely something that people you were still in some sense committed to the USSR as like a socialist project, definitely things that was definitely a step out of what was expected, or like what was expected, like there was some degree of tension between, whatever the significance of it, you can debate that. But there is definitely tension between people like Sartre, Althusser, and like the Communist Party of France for their, I don't know, what you might call heterodoxy or eclecticism. But that doesn't mean the political significance of this theoretical and philosophical eclecticism and does not mean does not have the political significance that I think people attribute to it. And that's a very important thing. So I just want to read that sentence that I'm referencing. Prior to 1968, there already existed an intellectual atmosphere in which various tendencies within French Marxism directed their efforts towards a new appropriation, liberated from any dogmatism of Marxian theory in general and Marxist capital in particular. On the theoretical level, the most significant intellectual process occurring in France between the poles of theory and politics were those carried out by Louis Althusser and his school. Footnote: for the process of development of the theory formed by Althusser in its various phases in the 1960s and 1970s cannot be adequately presented within the framework of the treatment here, nor do the constraints of space permit any discussion of Althusser's pre-1960 writings in the present study. With regard to Althusser's theoretical approach, it is significant that his theoretical interventions in the early and mid-1960s were undertaken within a historical situation in which Marxist theory was confronted by the antagonism between post-Stalinist dogmatism and a de-dogmatization which supposedly de-rigidified Marxist thought. Althusser created an alternative to this opposition within Marxist theory by opening up Marxist theory formation to a greater complexity through his reception of the concept of overdetermination from psychoanalytic theory, without, however, renouncing the claim to theoretical rigor and Marxist orthodoxy. In this way, he made a decisive contribution to the theoretical and political renovation of Marxism in the 1960s. Althusser aimed in particular to separate Marxian from Hegelian dialectic. An interpretation of Althusser as possible, which contends that he also pursued distinct political aims in his engagement with Marx's work. Althusser's approach to theory, and thus also to Marx's text, is in no way to be understood as a renunciation of political praxis. So sorry. I want to repeat that sentence because it seems like important. Althusser's theory to theory, and thus also to Marx's text, is in no way to be understood as a renunciation of political praxis. Decisive for Althusser were the struggle, including within the PCF, or perhaps especially in this context, over a new Marxist orthodoxy, and the project of elaborating a new kind of approach to truly revolutionary theory. Althusser's endeavors are thus certainly to be understood in a pedagogical sense. He functioned as the teacher of the up-and-coming elite of a new generation of revolutionary theoreticians, whose role was to provide the theory to accompany the revolutionary process in politics. Althusser insisted on the preeminent position of leading Marxist theoreticians. It should be noted that Althusser operated theoretically within two prominent institutions. Within the academic sphere, Althusser worked at the École Normale Supérieure, which was one of the most distinguished university institutions within France. Althusser's seminar on Marx in 1965 at the École Normale Supérieure attracted a circle of students that would subsequently have a decisive influence on the intellectual and in part also the political life of the French left. On the other hand, within the politico-intellectual sphere, the PCF was at least as important as an institutional point of reference, and here Althusser attempted to influence its political and theoretical orientation. Footnote: it's not possible within the constraints of the present study to go into more detail on the various phases of development of Althusser's relation to the Communist Party of France. End footnote. Althusser's theoretical work of the 1960s can also be understood as a political intervention in a more specific sense, namely insofar as one of his aims in this work, among others, was to provide an alternative to determinate interpretation of Marxism, i.e. the one which prevailed at a time within the PCF. Althusser wrote in 1968 that the critique of Stalinism, following the 20th Congress of the CPSU in 1956, had revived a, quote, petty bourgeois ideology within the communist parties, which, according to Althusser, corresponded to an interpretation of Marxism as, quote, humanism, and it focused on Marx's early writings, as well as on concepts such as, quote, human being, quote, alienation, quote, appropriation of the human essence, and quote, freedom. If you've listened to other videos, I'd be very cautious about... Never mind. Basically, the extent to which a actually humanist interpretation of Marxism within mainstream communism took place in the 1950s and 1960s is very questionable. Although there's people like Sartre who tried to do that, and he had obviously an influence in France, but also people like Roger Garaudy, very important communist intellectual who eventually converted to Islam and then became a prominent Holocaust denier. And then also Lucien Sèvres, who I think was kind of on a more humanist thing within the Communist Party of France. So I guess that's what he... But in general, in the Eastern... seemed like more of a particularly French thing than a generalized thing within international communism. Very much... there's I think especially Althusser's dismissive attitude towards the so-called pre-scientific Marx prior to the epistemological break, which I think in his view happened in, I want to say, the years 1846. It was a generally attitude that Althusser had was something that was extremely common in the Eastern Bloc. Extremely, because like clearly so much of the analysis of alienation could be so much applied to the Soviet Bloc. So they definitely criticize that. So people who emphasize the 1844 manuscripts are viewed as like Althusser views them as bourgeois, liberal, those kinds of things. Anyway, Althusser wrote in 1968 that the critique of Stalinism following the 20th Congress of the CPSU in 1956 had revived a, quote, petty bourgeois ideology within the communist parties, which, according to Althusser, corresponded to an interpretation of Marxism as, quote, humanism, and a focus on Marx's early writings, as well as on concepts such as, quote, human being, quote, alienation, quote, appropriation of the human essence, end quote, and, quote, freedom. Althusser makes his point as follows, quote, up to that point, the interpretation of Marxism is, quote, humanism, i.e. the ethical idealist interpretation of Marxist theory. The recourse to Marx's early writings had been the affair of bourgeois intellectuals, social democratic ideologues, or avant-garde theologians, among them some Catholics. From this point on, it was now the affair of numerous Marxists and communists themselves, end quote. Althusser. Following the 20th Congress of the CPSU, the attempt at a, quote, de-Stalinisation of French communism, partly resisted by the PCF, was bound up with the emergence of a, quote, humanist interpretation of Marxism within the PCF. Such an interpretation, it should be noted, was also promoted outside the party. It was precisely this tendency that Althusser criticized and against which he oriented his diametrically opposed, quote, anti-humanist interpretation of Marx. Althusser's position was especially counterposed to that of Roger Garaudy, an important protagonist of a humanist-oriented Marxism within the PCF of the post-Stalin era. Althusser refused to deviate from his, quote, theoretical anti-humanism, end quote. Footnote. On Garaudy and Althusser, see Gerland, 1978. On the discussion held by the Central Committee of the PCF in Argenteuil in 1966, as well as the reaction to it, see Jutt, 1986. And Kilnani. Where am I? Yeah, just a side note, one of Althusser's famous things is he was going to offer the first left-wing critique of Stalinism, which is a fucking joke. And it's notable that Althusser is not at all included in Marcel van der Linden's Western Marxism in the Soviet Union. Any user. In the second half of the 1960s, around 1967, Althusser moved more strongly than previously in a direction which ultimately amounted to taking a standpoint characterized by the, quote, primacy of politics. Althusser's position, which had previously stood in proximity to the principle of an autonomy of theory vis-a-vis politics, now shifted in a, quote, over-politicized, end quote, direction. Footnote. On the shift in Althusser's political and theoretical position around 1967, see among other works, Eliot, 1987, that's The Detour of Theory, by Gregory Eliot, which is on this channel. Very good book. I don't know if I agree necessarily with the politics of it too much, or what I take to be Eliot's politics, but the book in itself is very good. Lenin now became a centrally important point of reference in Althusser's thinking. Althusser emphasized the role of the class struggle, especially retrospectively. Thus he wrote in 1971 the, quote, the whole theory of Marx, i.e. the science founded by Marx, end quote, by which Althusser understands historical materialism, quote, and the philosophy inaugurated by Marx, end quote, by which Althusser understands a newly defined dialectical materialism, quote, has the class struggle at its heart and at its center, end quote. Footnote. In Althusser's theoretical interventions around 1970, it was especially his theory of, quote, ideological state apparatuses, end quote, that assumed essential importance. This cannot be further addressed here. However, political implications were manifest not only in Althusser's own theoretical work, but also in the critique by others of the theoretical corpus that he developed. Jacques Rancière, in theoretical terms one of the most significant students of Althusser and a co-author in the Lire la Capitale project, would subsequently denounce the, quote, reactionary political foundations, end quote, of this theoretical project, which his own study titled The Concept of, quote, Critique and the, quote, Critique of Political Economy, from the, quote, Paris manuscripts to Marx's Capital, formed a part, having been published in Lire la Capitale. Rancière's critique came after he had dissociated himself from the Althusser school and turned towards Maoism. He performed his political and theoretical volte-face against Althusser and the Althusserian school in the 1960s. Footnote. For Rancière's critique of Althusser, see Rancière 2011 on the theoretical and political confrontation between Althusser and John Lewis, a theorist from the ranks of the Communist Party of Great Britain, which took place at the beginning of the 1970s, see Arendts, Bischoff, and Yegi, 1973. For Althusser's critique of for E.P. Thompson's critique of Althusser, see Thompson, 1978. End footnote. According to the historian of Marxism, Montserrat Gasselin Huguet, quote, despite the fact that censorship still prevailed, end quote, in the final years of the Franco dictatorship in Spain, quote, book studies and essays on what Perry Anderson calls Western Marxism, quote, came ever more into the foreground, end quote. One of the best-known Marxist thinkers in Spain was the philosopher Manuel Sacristan Luzon. He lived from 1927 to 1985. Politically, Sacristan could be located within the context of the PCE, the Partido Comunista España, for a long period during the Franco dictatorship. From 1965 to 1970, he was a member of the party's Central Committee. Towards the end of the 1960s, the May 1968 events in Paris and the Prague Spring became sources of inspiration for his political thought. Sacristan's work can be considered as playing an important role in establishing the presuppositions of a theoretically advanced Marxism, which had to a great extent remained a desideratum. Insofar as he endeavored to contribute, through translation and reception, to the process whereby awareness of the contemporary state of the international debate on Marxism could be transferred to Spain, and to elevate the Spanish discourse on Marx and Marxism to the level of the international debate. In this regard, he engaged with the theories of Marx, Engels, Gramsci, Lukács, and the Frankfurt School, the Della Volpa School, as well as those of the contemporary Czech philosopher and interpreter of Marx, Jindřich Zelený. I have like the opening to his book on this channel. Zeleny's. Sacristan related critically to Althusserianism, which was widely received in Spain in the 1970s. Footnote. Sacristan's relation to Althusser is dealt with by Salvador Lopez Arnal in 2007. And footnote. A recently published collection of Sacristan's writings on Marx's critique of political economy afford an insight into his reading of the Grundrisse, theories of surplus value and capital. This is notable insofar as it demonstrates that a reception of Marx's blueprints for the construction of the critique of political economy has occurred within the Spanish engagement with Marx. Sacristan endeavored to retrace the sequence of Marx's structural outlines of the critique of political economy with meticulous attention to detail. Considered as a whole, Sacristan's work represented an important contribution to the development of an advanced Marxism in a country with a historically weaker Marxist tradition. than Italy or France, which remains the case today. In the Anglo-Saxon countries, Marx-oriented intellectuals moving within the context of the charged relationship between theory and politics encountered a great level of resistance than did their Italian or French comrades. This was due to the fact that such intellectuals are confronted in the Anglo-Saxon world both by a more widespread militant anti-communism and by a more pronounced tradition of pragmatism, which is also to be encountered on the political left with its hostility towards theory. In the United Kingdom, a, quote, first new left, end quote, emerged in the wake of the political events of 1956 and aimed to renovate socialist politics beyond the orthodoxy of the Communist Party. The, quote, first new left, end quote, in the UK, whose best named representative is perhaps the historian and, quote, socialist humanist E.P. Thompson, who had resigned from the Communist Party, can in turn be distinguished from a, quote, second new left of the 1960s and 1970s. I think there's a book called The First New Left, actually, that's precisely about this generation of people who left the Communist Party in the wake of 1956. Which is interesting. One of the most important intellectual protagonists of this, quote, second new left, end quote, Perry Anderson, was concerned to make continental theoretical currents, i.e. so-called Western Marxism, known to the British public. It should be known. To my understanding, Perry Anderson was kind of a sort of, he's an academic, but he's like, and he wrote for the New Left Review. But to my understanding, was kind of like influenced heavily by like what you might call like Orthodox Trotskyism. So, which means the more conservative, more pro-Soviet end of Trotskyism. So like Ernest Mandel, and Isaac Deutscher. Isaac Deutscher himself being kind of comparable, I think, in a lot of ways to Perry Anderson, and kind of being like not particularly like involved, to my understanding at least, particularly involved in like Trotskyist politics after World War. When he was like an independent scholar in Great Britain. So kind of a comparable thing, like kind of a lot of the interpretations of the history of the left and in the history of capitalism and the history of all kinds of things. They're interpretations of the world philosophically and historically influenced by this kind of constellation of post-war Trotskyist intellectuals. That's at least my understanding. Could be wrong. I think there's a book on Perry Anderson by Gregory Elliott, which would be interesting to read. Not only did British Marxists originally have no great part in, quote, Western Marxism, not one of the prominent exponents of, quote, Western Marxism was British. But as a rule, most British Marxists had neither an adequate knowledge of these, quote, alien theorists, nor any great interest in their thought until the intercultural mediation undertaken by Anderson in the New Left Review, which he edited. The transfer of theory which did then occur from the continent to the UK in the 1960s and 1970s, and the initiation and intensification of the reception of, quote, Western Marxism were regarded with suspicion by E.P. Thompson, who remained to a large extent blinkered by an insular provincialism and aimed criticism at Althusser in particular. Footnote: the processes of theory formation within the New Left in the USA are investigated by Richard Gorosky in 1980. I should read that book. End footnote. A typical characterization is given by Herbert Marcuse's 1967 assessment of the American New Left, which he claims is, with the exception of a few small groups, quote, not orthodox Marxists or socialists, is characterized by a deep mistrust of all ideology, even socialist ideology, end quote. I think important in the in American leftism in this period, I think it was one of the people that was very important, was kind of like what you might call like left-wing kind of more empirical sociology. So The person I'm mainly thinking of is C. Wright Mills, who wrote a book called The Power Elite, which I think was really influential in large segments of the New Left in terms of like how they theoretically understood the world they were living in. Yeah. Obviously, it should be said that there was people that were a little bit more theoretically sophisticated, but perhaps this was like the 70s. That had a little bit more of like a Marxist orientation, but also like a critical Marxist orientation, or at least like a one that, was a root and branch, which is kind of oriented around Paul Maddock and I think his son as well. Paul Maddock Jr. definitely, and I think Paul Maddock Sr. as well, but also, yeah. Anyway, but the journal Root and Branch is like a libertarian socialist journal that kind of like had a degree of theoretical sophistication. And I'm sure there were others. That's just the one I know best. Oh, Jesus Christ. So where the hell am I? However, it ought to be noted that the hostility to ideology designated by Marcuse was a concealing and euphemistic characterization, disguising a deep hostility to theory. However, it ought to be noted that the hostility to ideology designated by Marcuse was a concealing and euphemistic characterization, disguising a deep-seated hostility to theory. James William Chesebro cites Tom Hayden, one of the most important precursors of the New Left in the U.S., who asserted the New Left was based, quote, more on feeling than on theory, end quote. Such an attitude was not exactly conducive to an intensive engagement with Marx's critique of political economy. While George Kastiafakis attributes, quote, theoretical strengths, end quote, to the West German New Left, in his retrospective historical appraisal, he refers to, quote, the militant pragmatism, end quote, of the American New Left. From the end of the 1960s onward, parts of the American New Left moved towards different variants of Marxism or Marxism-Leninism. I'm getting excited. My friend is writing on this very topic of like French New Left relation to political economy and class struggle and all these kinds of things. In fact, it was precisely a representative of the Frankfurt School, Herbert Marcuse, who lived from 1898 to 1979, who became a mentor to parts of the student opposition in the U.S., accompanying them theoretically and politically. During the student revolts, Marcuse acted as a constant point of reference for the radical students. This was the case not least because his thought represented an alternative to Marxist or Marxist-Leninist orthodoxy of Soviet provenance. I want to say that one of the main people that Marcuse ostensibly influenced was Angela Davis. Angela Davis was like a candidate in like 1970 or something like that for the mainstream Communist Party of the United States. So how actually unorthodox she was, maybe a brave activist or something like that, but I would be very cautious about saying that she was not like it seems like there's very much a gulf between, I don't know, like the theory, which is kind of like Marcuse, and the politics of someone like Davis. Davis, I think also in the early 1970s, she's, when she travels to Europe, not only sees students or whatever, but also Honecker of the, I can't remember his first name, of East Germany. Goes to East Germany and sees like the top brass of the party, you know what I mean? So like her, this idea that Marcuse just has this influence over this, non-ideological Marxist, undogmatic left in the United States, I would very, very much be cautious of. Not that he didn't have an influence or whatever, but I'm just saying that like people who have some kind of relationship with Marcuse, that doesn't really necessarily say very much about what their politics are. Although Marcuse did not see in the oppositional students and protesting ethnic minorities a new subject of the revolutionary process, a subject that could, quote, replace the working class in the proper sense, he did accord them a kind of, quote, precursor function within a possible liberatory and transformative process. Marcuse considered that the formation of emancipatory theory had to react to the significant alterations in the social and political situation, the point of departure for the formation of theory. Since Marx's time, that theory had to be renewed accordingly. Marcuse's own theoretical approaches are located within this context. Section 2 of Chapter 1 of Marx Worldwide on the Development of the International Discourse on Marx since 1965 by Jan Hoff. I don't know why I'm saying the full title again. What the hell's wrong with me? I sound so stupid. But this new section, Latin America and Asia. The best known and most influential Marxist thinker in Latin America in the first half of the 20th century was the Peruvian José Carlos Mariátegui. I don't know if I'm saying that guy's name right. I feel like I'm not. According to Raúl Fornet Batancourt, this thinker attempted in the 1920s until his death in 1930 to use the Marxist approach as a, quote, guide to creative thinking, to thinking which sees this historical task as that of adequately analyzing the concrete reality which determines its own context, end quote. Mariátegui's thought forms an important stage within a theoretically productive line of development of Marxist thought of Latin American provenance. This innovative Latin American theoretical tradition was of renewed relevance in the 1960s. Footnote: space does not permit a consideration here of Latin American dependency theory, which developed in particular from the 1960s onwards and relied at least in part on elements of theory from the Marxist tradition. Parallels between dependency theory and the thought of Enrique Dussel, which will be considered in more detail later, cannot be dismissed out of hand. End footnote. The Brazilian historian of Marxism, Michael Luvi, maintains that the Cuban Revolution, which took place in 1958 to 59 and underwent a process of political and ideological radicalization in the subsequent years, favored an intellectual atmosphere which is conducive to a renewal of Latin American Marxism and which influenced its emancipation from the model of Marxism-Leninism of the Soviet kind. I'd be cautious about that. Obviously, to my understanding, at least, my dumb understanding of the Cuban Revolution, it was not a socialist revolution. It only became so after the fact. To my understanding, it was kind of the idea is like a national liberation, bourgeois democratic national liberation, or at least it was its ostensible goal. And at first, I think it tried to have a more friendly relationship with the United States, and that failed. Then the Soviet Union was there. That's my understanding. I don't know what I'm talking about. So take what I'm saying with a grain of salt. But it was very, very much Soviet aligned, and also very important if you're interested in, if you're talk about it wasn't even like particularly that, wasn't as critical as other radical left interpretations of the 20th century, but Trotskyism. Say you're a Trotskyist, right? And Michael Luvi is a Trotskyist, and most Trotskyists always have a very, very strong dose of masochism in their bones. Really don't care if states that nationalize private property also concurrently kill all the Trotskyists or lock them all up, as they did in this Cuban case. Was in terms of places where there was a Trotskyist presence, the Trotskyists were merely jailed. But in relation to that, if you know who Ramon Mercader, I think it's his name, Mercader is, who, if you don't know who that is, that was the assassin of Leon Trotsky. Leon Trotsky was assassinated in 1940. Ramon Mercader spent 20 years in prison in Mexico for this assassination. And when he was released, he was given all like the Order of Lenin and all that kind of shit. But the I think it was the first place he went and where he ended up living was Cuba. And he was given a hero's welcome by Che Guevara. And his main claim to fame, in fact, was the assassination of Leon Trotsky. So Leon Trotsky's assassination was given a hero's welcome in Cuba, in addition to the jailing of the Trotskyists there. This history is not important to many Trotskyists because, after all, the Cuban state nationalized private property. So what's the cost of, what's wrong with the repression of Trotskyists if they do that? The Cuba was one of the better places to be a Trotskyist in the wake of a Stalinist revolution or a Stalinist development. Unlike Mao's China, where people went to prison or were killed or went to prison for 30 years, or in the case of Vietnam, all those kinds of things. If you know anything about international Trotskyism in places that aren't that didn't experience Stalinist revolutions in the wake of World War II, if you know anything about that broader intellectual history, you'll know that the destruction of the international left opposition was not something localized at all to the USSR. Anyway, so perhaps on very high theoretical altitude, there was room for maneuver, but again, you don't want to. I really, really am cautious about mistaking greater theoretical flexibility with some kind of this being anything indicative of political progress, much less social progress. So that's my comment. There's a dispute between Michael Louvy and Samuel Farber, who's of kind of a third camp Trotskyist orientation, about whether the Cuban Revolution and Fidelism and Castroism constitute emancipatory social projects or substantially emancipatory social projects. And of course, what should go without saying, although some idiots are bad at thinking, they shouldn't say anything positive about the embargo of Cuba or the Batista dictatorship or the very, very brutal role of American imperialism in Latin America. Obviously, but when people say, "Oh, you criticize people who were anti-U.S. imperialism, therefore you're pro-U.S. imperialism." That's not what's going on here. It's a very dumb way of thinking, and I'm not your dad, but I encourage you not to think that way. Anyway, the Brazilian historian of Marxism, Michael Louvy, maintains that the Cuban Revolution, which took place in 1958 and 1959, underwent a process of political and ideological radicalization in the subsequent years, favored an intellectual atmosphere which was conducive to a renewal of Latin American Marxism, and which influenced its emancipation from the model of Marxism-Leninism of the Soviet kind. Louvy expands on this point as follows. In the 1960s, Cuba saw a, quote, flourishing of sociological, historical, and philosophical research, a witness to the existence of a creative and open Marxism, end quote, which found expression in the Cuban journal Pensamiento Crítico. Footnote. Johanka Leon del Rio goes into more detail on the development of Marxist-oriented philosophy in Cuba in the 1960s. End footnote. The decisive circumstance here is that the Cuban Revolution provided a stimulus in theoretical and political terms in relation not only to the situation in Cuba, but also to that in Latin America as a whole. Also worthy of consideration, within the context of the tension between theory and politics, is the thought of one of the most important Latin American Marx-inspired philosophers of the 1960s who collaborated in the development of an undogmatic Marxism in Central and South America, the Mexican Adolfo Sanchez Vasquez. Sanchez Vasquez was born in 1915 in Spain and fled to Mexico after the Spanish Civil War. However, insofar as it was particularly subsequent events in Latin America that formed an important frame of reference for his political and philosophical thought, he is to be understood more as a Latin American philosopher than as a European one. This is particularly true in relation to the Cuban Revolution. In 1978, Sanchez Vasquez responded to the question as to what the Cuban Revolution had signified for him as follows, quote, "With my first live and direct encounter with the men and the accomplishments of the Cuban Revolution in 1964, my book Las Ideas Estéticas de Marx, bracket, published in English as Art and Society, and bracket, would not have been possible. Nor would my effort to make my way through Marxism in my book Philosophy of Praxis, casting aside the crutch of the instruction manuals," end quote. Cited in Gondler. So it's Stefan Gondler wrote a big book on, I think it's like Critical Marxism in Mexico, which I'd love to read. It's very exciting. Ideas here. A significant political movement that formed the backdrop of the theoretical discussion of the subsequent years was the Mexican student movement of the 1960s, whose decisive turning point came with the massacre in the Plaza de las Tres Culturas in October 1968. Stefan Gondler quotes Sanchez Vasquez's retrospective evaluation of those events. Quote, "Although it was crushed, the movement of 68 changed the political physiognomy of the country, and from that point onward, the Universidad Nacional was never the same again. Marxism was a critical and anti-dogmatic edge, became one of the most vigorous currents. Marxism with a critical and anti-dogmatic edge became one of the most vigorous currents of thought in the institutions of the UNAM, the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico, one of the most important academic institutions in the whole of Latin America, and especially in the humanities." Unquote. Again, cited in Gondler. Alongside Gondler, Wolfgang Fritz Haug is one of the few Germans to have engaged with these Mexican thinkers. Already at the beginning of the 1980s, Haug emphasized the undogmatic character of Sanchez Vasquez's philosophy. According to Haug, Sanchez Vasquez binds, quote, "Marxist philosophers to the incontrovertibility of discussion and alignment within Marxism, counter to any claim to a monopoly," end quote. Sanchez Vasquez identifies Marx's turn to the category of praxis as the decisive moment of the latter's thought. Sanchez Vasquez's interpretation of Marx remains problematic, however, insofar as he relies first and foremost on Marx's early work, the theses on Feuerbach among others, and only engages with the mature Marxian critique of political economy to a limited extent, even though in his view of Marx's work as a whole, he rejects the idea of a radical rupture in Marx's development, as is emphasized by Gondler. Sanchez Vasquez's book, titled The Philosophy of Praxis, must be considered one of his most important works, where he attempts from the perspective of a philosophy of praxis to go beyond traditional Marxist orthodoxy and to open the way for a different understanding of Marxism. This book first appeared in 1967, i.e. before the high point of the Mexican student movement, and in subsequent years became an important point of reference in the Latin American discussion on Marxism. Footnote: in a preface written in 1972, the English language edition of this book, Sanchez Vasquez himself refers to the, quote, "enthusiastic reception of this study," end quote, by the public, end footnote. In Japan, interest in Marxist theory intensified in the post-war period. For an adequate presentation, with the historical setting of important Marxist theoretical approaches located within the context of the tension between theory and politics, it is necessary first to go back further in time and to touch upon a significant theoretical and political controversy in the Japanese Marxism of the interwar and immediate post-war period. In 1922, a communist party was constituted under the aegis of the Comintern. The party received directives from the Comintern in the 1920s and 1930s in the shape of various draft theses, with the theses of 1932 finally being regarded as definitive. According to the later Comintern directive, the revolution was to be thought of as occurring in two phases. It was a question first of eliminating the tenno system by means of bourgeois revolution. Once this had taken place, the socialist revolution could then be organized. In the early 1930s, a group of Marxist researchers, the so-called, quote, lecture school, Koza Ha, published a multi-volume work on the development of Japanese capitalism, in which they set out the conceptions that seemed adequate to the task of undergirding the Communist Party strategy prescribed by the Comintern. According to Setsuo Furihata, a central thesis of the lectures school was that, as a whole, the Meiji reform merely constituted a transformation in which, quote, purely feudal land ownership had been reorganized into semi-feudal land ownership, end quote. Hiroshi Mizuta underscores the significance in this context of the theorist Moritaro Yamada, who lived from 1897 to 1980. Yamada, quote, an associate professor of Tokyo Imperial University and the most influential of those authors of the lecture school, the Kozaha school, published a book based on his contributions, bracket, to the above-mentioned multi-volume work, in bracket. The book was entitled Analysis of Japanese Capitalism, ... and called ironically a Bible for his disciples, end quote. Mizuta. Hiroshi Mizuta. The ultimate judgment of the lecture school as to the previous and contemporary economic structures and developments in Japan contrasted with the thesis put forward by Marxist researchers from the milieu around the journal Worker and Farmers, Rono Ha, and the communist politician Hitoshi Yamakawa. The latter's faction had opposed the steering of the communist movement in Japan by the Comintern and had split from the party. The thesis of the worker-farmer faction amounted to the following point of view. The Rono Ha understood the Meiji era as a quasi-bourgeois transformation and grasped contemporary Japanese society as the one which was already developing primarily in a capitalist direction. The worker-farmer faction diverged from the conceptions of the lecture school on a decisive point. The latter considered that the process of social transformation was less advanced in a capitalist direction than could be surmised from the position of the former. Accordingly, a further development of the thesis of the worker-farmer faction implied that the political strategy was to be focused directly on the socialist revolution rather than a revolution in two phases. According to Tessa, Morris Suzuki, Itsura Saka, one of the important theorists of the worker-farmer faction, made a critical intervention against the supposed tendency of the lecture school to regard the Japanese society of the post-Meiji era as a static formation. Morris Suzuki writes that Saka's criticism of the lecture school was that the latter, quote, entirely ignores the profound changes that have occurred and continue to occur within the system, above all the gradual transformation of the peasantry into a modern proletariat, end quote. Morris Suzuki. The theoretical and also in a secondary sense political controversy between the lecture school and the worker-farmer faction shaped the Japanese Marxist milieu of the 1930s, which was nonetheless subjected to increasingly brutal state repression until 1945. Just a side note, I took a class on Japan, and it kind of seems like, it's very interesting, it seems like there's a parallel thing of like a lot of democratic possibility kind of being opened up in the early 1920s in Japan. I forget what they're called, but it was like kind of seemed to me like something kind of Weimar adjacent in the 1920s in Japan, but that's not important here. I was just thinking of that. Japanese history is something that I took a class on it, and like I wasn't that interested in it before, and now I'm like, man, I want to know more. In the post-war period, both a quote neo-lecture school and a quote neo-worker-farmer faction approach was constituted. The former remained consistent in its proximity to the official party line of the Japanese Communist Party, thus forming a continuity with the lecture school of the interwar period. Following a brief phase of radicalization towards the beginning of the 1950s, the period of the so-called Molotov cocktail program, The Japanese Communist Party switched in the second half of the 1950s to a more moderate course, gradually orienting itself toward the political perspective of, quote, structural reform, which is, he says this. I was to say that, didn't he just say that about Italy? A parallel can certainly be drawn here with the Italian Communist Party. Both parties demonstrated certain characteristics which anticipated the subsequent emergence of Euro-communism. The, quote, neo-worker-farmer faction moved within the orbit of the non-communist party left socialist spectrum. Itsuro Sakisaka, who lived from 1897 to 1985, one of the important theorists of the worker-farmer faction of the 1930s, became a leading protagonist of a politically and theoretically oriented group with its roots in the worker-farmer faction. This was the Socialist Association, which was active within the Socialist Party. Sakisaka demonstrates that Marxism-Leninism was also embraced by left-wing Japanese intellectuals outside the Japanese Communist Party. Although Sakisaka argued that Japan's revolution would pursue its own peaceful course, he did not criticize the shortcomings of the Soviet experience, nor did he limit the validity of Marxism-Leninism to the Soviet Union. He envisaged the JSP, the Japanese Socialist Party, as a party ideologically based on Marxism-Leninism. Yet Sakisaka was equally active politically and theoretically also in Marx research in the post-war period. Sakisaka translated all 3 volumes of Marx's Capital. The first of these translations was published in 1947 and the others subsequently. Although the predominant Marxist-Leninist theoretical orthodoxy within the orbit of the JCP was of great influence among Japanese leftist intellectuals in the post-war period, it is also appropriate here to consider Japanese intellectuals with an orientation towards Marxism, whose political and theoretical work presented an alternative to the theoretical orthodoxy of the JCP and contributed to the, quote, de-Stalinisation of the intelligentsia of the Japanese left. An example of a, quote, alternative and moreover fairly influential current of thought within Japanese Marxism, which developed in clear demarcation from theoretical Stalinism from the 1960s onwards in the, quote, civil society school. Within this theoretical orientation, Hideaki Hirata elaborated a critique of actually existing socialism, which drew on Marx himself. However, it was not only within this theoretical tendency that critiques of real socialism or theoretical Stalinism were developed. An intellectual who exerted notable influence in the course of the attempted, quote, de-Stalinization of the Japanese left as early as the 1950s was Tadayuki Tsushima, who lived from 1901 to 1979. Tsushima had an extremely critical attitude towards the political and social system of the USSR in particular and disputed its socialist character. To this convinced anti-Stalinist, the USSR was a state capitalist country under the rule of a bureaucratic dictatorship. Tsushima held that within a socialist society there is no law of value, the labor objectified within a product does not take the form of value, and value itself and the value form are non-existent. Tsushima's conception can be supplemented as follows. If Marxian theory is extended in a certain direction, it becomes apparent that the products of labor in a socialist society result from immediately socialized labor rather than from private labor, which first assumes the character of universal social labor within the process of exchange, as is the case in capitalist society. Value character and the commodity form of the products of labor within the capitalist mode of production are the necessary result of a determinate, historically specific mode of the socialization of labor. This mode is to be abolished in socialist society. By contrast, Stalin's conception implied that the law of value could also exist in a socialist society. Stalin proceeded from this assumption in his late text, Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR of 1952. Tsushima criticized this text in his 1956 work, Myths of the Kremlin, in which he denounced Stalin's theoretical incomprehension. For the Japanese theorist, the existence of the law of value meant that Soviet society could by no means be considered a socialist one. The non-existence of the categories of value and money within the socialist mode of production was a necessary implication of Marx's value theory. What was I going to say? I had a thought. my main thought was, this is very interesting because it seems very this analysis seems very close to that of like well, to a lot of people, obviously, but especially with the emphasis on value. See, that's kind of one of the things that I think is very interesting here, and obviously, the more I read is like, as great as Western Marxism in the Soviet Union is by Marcel van der Linden, there's obviously people that are left out, obviously, like I said before and earlier, I think earlier in this video, about, German operatismo critiques of Soviet society. But I think this is very groundbreaking stuff here in particular, especially in this Japanese context. I think is super fascinating because most of the critiques of the USSR that were coming from people who either called it state capitalist, bureaucratic, collectivist, or whatever, they mostly characterized it as the value categories of like market and exchange and like the buying and selling of commodities were not really two important parts of the critiques of the USSR in this period. And to the extent that they were included in kind of an inconsistent way. For instance, people say USSR state capitalist because it, engaged in international trade or something like that. It produced commodities that it sold on the world market, which I think historically, to my understanding at least, maybe I'm wrong, was kind of like historically rather limited in the USSR, at least in the Stalin period, especially because a lot of the products that were made in the Soviet Union were so bad and couldn't really compete with like with like the commodities that are coming out of like more developed nations, that were more developed countries. So I think there's like a limit to which you could say that there was actually, I'm not exactly sure. And some people say, basically, I wrote a thesis, my master's thesis, about critiques of Leon Trotsky's degenerated worker state thesis within the Trotskyist movement as a whole. And one of my critiques of those people is that they they failed to clarify probably the most fundamental aspects of what capitalism is, which is a society in which the product of labor in general, central products, very important products of labor, whether it be from food to energy and all of that, take the form of the commodities which are sold on a market at a profit. So central to that, prior to even profit, is on a theoretical level, is the commodity character of the labor product. And people who either say that the USSR is capitalist or whatever, but don't really make that the commodity character of labor and the process of buying and selling a linchpin of their analysis, are they're failing to adequately conceptualize capitalism and the way you could meaningfully apply that term to a Soviet-type society. But this, what I'm reading here, I forgot this from the book, is fucking super fascinating to me, and I'd like to read more about it, where it's like, in the 1950s, independently in Japan, independently from a lot of these other discussions I'm imagining, people are criticizing, talking about the law of like commodities and buying and selling in the USSR and the significance of that. I don't know. It might be a wrong analysis. It might be faulty. Maybe it's like empirically incorrect or theoretically inadequate. But the very fact that they're talking about these things is very important. I mean, some other people that kind of would do this to a large extent would be like, and I don't know how great the analysis is, but like Amadeo Bordiga would kind of talk about the importance of like the exchange principle of buying and selling in the USSR, and how that had a capitalist character. But until then, I think that like a lot of the people that were until him, and then Charles Bettelheim, and obviously Paresh Chattopadhyay, so a Frenchman, an Italian, and a I believe, Indian, French, Canadian, Paresh Chattopadhyay. I don't think that there was, I don't think the role of buying and selling of commodities was particularly important to any of the analysis. They were kind of like an afterthought. They were kind of like ad hoc tacked in, but but if you're like using a critique of political economy as your like reference point for that, that's a faulty methodology. So that there's someone in Japan doing these kinds of critiques, like I'm pretty jazzed up right now. I don't know, maybe you don't think that's as super cool as me, but I think it is. It's also interesting too, and I don't know, I haven't really, I should probably have a thing where I talk to people, but like Michael Showerty, who wrote an essay on Samizo Kuruma. I think it's Samizo Kuruma. Is that how you say his name? It was a very, very important Marxist theoretician in Japan who kind of in the vein of like, and I think independently so, kind of like in the vein of like Bauhaus and Reichel, obviously, but also in prior to that, Rubin independently emphasized the necessarily like monetary, that value must necessarily be have its has necessary form of expression, exchange value, i.e. Money. That's the only meaningful measure of value. Value being a necessarily monetary category, and abstract labor being a category specific to commodity production. But Michael Showerty edited the writings, it's called The Genesis of Money by Samizo Kuruma, which I learned about through reading this book, Marx Worldwide. I think I'm not exactly sure what his politics are, but for some reason I feel like he's related to like the world socialism movement, and the world socialism movement being kind of, what's the word? Having its genesis in the Socialist Party of Great Britain. Obviously, it has like sister parties in the rest of the world. The Socialist Party of Great Britain, obviously being, an impossibilist, parliamentary, but like non-reformist socialist party, which conceptualizes socialism as a stateless, moneyless, non-commodity producing society, classless society, and I think probably, a society free of religion. I think they're pretty committed to, secularism and cosmopolitanism, internationalism, all those fucking things that are super sick in a sea of left-wing politics that typically doesn't do that. But I think he's kind of like of that tradition. So I'm curious if he would have opinions about this relationship between this Japanese author's critique of Stalinism and his own view and the views of like that whole orientation, the world socialist orientation. I think that's what the movement's called. But yeah, sorry I'm rambling on, but that's fucking pretty stoked about that. There's a footnote. Marx himself wrote in the Critique of the Gotha program, quote, within the cooperative society based on common ownership of the means of production, the producers do not exchange their products, just as little does the labor employed on the products appear here as the value of these products, as a material quality possessed by them. Since now, in contrast to capitalist society, individual labor no longer exists in an indirect fashion, but directly as a component part of the total labor, end quote, Marx. End footnote. A further critique of Stalinism deserves a somewhat more detailed consideration. In the 1950s and 1960s, an economic school of thought developed in Japan, which is referred to as the Uno School after its founder, the quote, end quote, doyen, Kozo Uno, who lived from 1897 to 1977, and which attracted numerous intellectuals with an interest in the formation of Marxist theory. It should be pointed out, in order to prevent any misunderstanding, that Uno can in no way be described as a political leading figure. He himself eschewed any great political engagement. For many young intellectuals, however, Uno and his school represented a compelling theoretical alternative to Marxism-Leninism, from which Uno consistently distanced himself. Uno's thought thus served as a point of reference for a portion of those Marx-oriented intellectuals who felt no affinity towards orthodox Marxism-Leninism and its Japanese adepts. To this extent, his thought also had an effect precisely within the field defined by the charged relationship between theory and politics. An important criterion which distinguishes Uno's theory from Marxism-Leninism consists in Uno's critical opposition to the doctrine of dialectical materialism. His revision of the traditional understanding of Marxism within the Japanese and international orthodoxy also extended to the postulate of the, quote, unity of theory and practice, end quote. Uno broke with this authoritative doctrine of Marxism-Leninism. Uno himself attached great importance to the separation of the process of theory formation from any direct political engagement. For this reason, affiliation to the Uno school by no means implied the adoption of a determinate political position. This remains the case today. In fact, in his own self-understanding, Uno did not at all consider himself to be a Marxist, even though he located himself theoretically within Marx's tradition. For Uno, the term, quote, Marxist denoted an intensive participation in political practice, for which reason he rejected this description for himself, despite his affinity with Marx and socialism. Despite his inclination towards a supposed abstinence in practice and the separation of the process of theory formation from immediate political engagement, Uno by no means shied away from openly criticizing Stalinism. Uno expressed his criticism already in the 1950, contrary to Stalin's conception according to which the law of value would continue to apply. In socialism, Uno advanced the view that a socialist economy, quote, should aim at the abolition of economic laws such as the law of value dominant in capitalist society, end quote. Uno's theory was in turn the object of vehement critique on the part of orthodox Marxist-Leninists within the intelligentsia of the Japanese left. Within the context of the tension between theory and practice, another important aspect of Uno's work consists in his attribution of a, quote, scientific character to Marx's critique of political economy. In contrast to his evaluation of historical materialism, which he accords the status of a mere, quote, ideological hypothesis, this, quote, heretical proposition is to be considered against a background in which historical materialism was held to be of considerable scientific significance within the theoretical understanding of intellectuals close to the Japanese Communist Party. The Uno scholar Thomas Sakine reflects the Uno school conception as follows. Quote, socialism never becomes a science. Socialism remains an ideology. Socialism does not become even more defensible because of the formulation of the materialistic conception of history. The conception otherwise known as historical materialism is an ideological hypothesis, end quote, Sakine. Political economy, according to Sakine, is the scientific basis of Marxism, yet Marxism, including socialism, is not a science. It is an ideology based on scientific achievements. Uno, one of the most influential thinkers with an orientation towards Marxian theory in Japan, clearly broke with the traditional orthodox Marxist conception of, quote, scientific socialism, without, however, renouncing his advocacy of socialism in the sense of a political standpoint. The historian of Marxism, Hirumi Fukuzawa, maintains that the impact of Uno's magnum opus from the beginning of the 1950s, Kaizai Genran, can be in part attributed to Uno's assertion that it is necessary to separate political economy as a science from the question of the political utility of theory formation. Fukuzawa adds the following, quote, the explosive character of this assertion is only imaginable on the basis of a familiarity with the Marxist camp at that time. Any criticism of Marx would immediately entail the critic being branded as anti-Marxist, and the Marxist theory was understood as the handmaid to politics for the sake of the revolution, end quote. Fukuzawa. Uno's views by no means cause him to be discredited in the eyes of the entire politically active intellectual left in Japan, however. one of the most important points of reference of the Japanese student movement of the 1960s, alongside the protest against the Vietnam War, was in particular the rejection of the military, quote, security policy, end quote, alliance between Japan and the United States, which found its expression in the militant protest against the, quote, security treaties, end quote, of 1960 and 1970. The left-wing student umbrella organization, Zengakuren, All Japan Federation of Student Self-Government Associations, had already been founded in 1948. In subsequent years, it underwent a process of radicalization, having first stood more or less under the control of the Japanese Communist Party until the emergence of the Japanese New Left in the second half of the 1950s. From the late 1950s onwards, a new left was formed amid a continual process of regrouping, i.e. a left beyond the classical Moscow-oriented party communism and beyond the Marxism of the Japanese Socialist Party. In the late 1960s, the spectrum of the student left had developed into a complex structure of rival Communist Party left socialist, Trotskyist, Maoist, and anarchist groupings, with violent struggles erupting between the various factions in some instances. Footnote: a detailed overview of the various groupings and organizations can be found in McCormick, 1971. And that's from the article Student Left in Japan, New Left Review, 1971, by Gavin McCormick. Despite his distinction between, quote, science on the one hand and socialist, quote, ideology on the other, and despite his own, quote, academic abstinence from practice, Uno's theoretical approach exerted a certain magnetic effect on parts of the Japanese New Left. Andrew Barchet depicts the situation as follows. Quote, this same combination of a demonstrated anti-Stalinism, Stalin being betrayed as willfully distorting Marxism, with a powerful systematizing drive that provided Uno's economics as academic bona fides, may also have made it attractive to elements of the radical student movement and a left-wing fraction of the Socialist Party. End quote. Barchet. And that's in reference to the book by Andrew E. Barchet titled The Social Sciences in Modern Japan, the Marxian and Modernist Traditions, published in 2004. And footnote. This is especially true of the process of theory formation within the Japanese Communist League, not to be confused with the Japanese Communist Party, one of the best-known organizations of the New Left, founded in 1958. Uno's theory was critically acclaimed, not least by Kenichi Kuroda. In the period of the formation of the New Left, Kenichi Kuroda was a leading theorist of the Japan Revolutionary Communist League, which had emerged from the Japan Trotskyist League. Kuroda's interpretation of the exposition of Marx's critique of political economy is noteworthy insofar as he formulated a critique of the reading of Marx's commodity theory as a theory of historical, pre-capitalist, quote, simple commodity production, end quote, as early as the 1960s. This is all very, I think this is kind of why this book is written, is because it's like showing that, like, yeah, it's not just like a few people who are thinking these kind of making these very important observations, right? There's a reading of Marx which comes from Engels, which he'll probably mention soon, but the Engels, the historico-logical conception of Marx's capital, that Marx's capital is a kind of a history book at a high altitude of abstraction that proceeds. So when Marx concretizes the analysis of capitalism, so say for instance, proceeding from from exchange to purchases and sales of commodities to capital to various phases of surplus, accumulation to I don't know, all the way up to the, throughout the three basically that capital is kind of like talking about capitalism in like a certain historical way, whereas value, the theory of value, say like, especially when you're talking specifically about value categories, right? When you're talking about, say, at the most elementary level, like exchange value, right? Which is distinct from, say, prices of production, which is value, talks about value in the sense of like, okay, different industries have different value compositions within them between that which is money which is spent on labor and labor power versus that which is spent on everything else, means of production, and since different products have different amounts of physical labor that go into them, the value. Sorry, I'm getting too carried away here. Trying to explain prices of production. I don't need to do that. Basically, the idea that once upon a time there was this thing called simple commodity production, which developed into capitalism. Right, and that's like kind of like the reading of the opening chapters. Right, Marx is talking about a pre-capitalist, simple commodity producing society, which is many people criticize. For instance, I have a piece by Chris Arthur, very important reader of Marx and commentator on Marx, and an interesting theorist in his own right. Says that no, what Marx is talking about is like on the most high altitude of abstraction, the principles of simple commodity circulation, buying and selling of commodities, the circulation of commodities, simple buying and selling, in abstraction, in theoretical abstraction, in conceptual abstraction, from the existence of capital. He's not talking about a pre-capitalist society in any capacity here. But that's a very, very influential reading that is true of, that kind of has, wasn't quite bucked against in a generalized sense until this period that Hoff is talking about. At least that's my understanding. Maybe people earlier critiqued this reading of simple commodity production, but I don't know them, and I know that if people did critique it, it was very much a minority position. In Kuroda's work, the political bearing of his interpretation of Marx's Capital is immediately evident. Kuroda wrote in the 1960s that Marx's Capital is a, quote, mental weapon for the self-liberation of the proletariat all over the world, as well as being the monumental achievement of Marxism, end quote. Kuroda. In political and theoretical terms, Kuroda was concerned to distance contemporary European and Asian, quote, actually existing socialism, end quote, from the thought of Marx and Lenin. Quote, the socialist Soviet Union, realized through the Russian Revolution in 1917, has undergone Stalinist degeneration. It exists as something alike in appearance but quite different in nature from the socialism envisaged by Marx and Lenin. It is not restricted to the contemporary Soviet Union. The so-called, quote, socialist countries in Eastern Europe and Asia exist as something different from socialist societies or states under proletarian dictatorship, clarified theoretically by Marx and Lenin. And didn't he just say this guy was a Trotskyist? Yeah, so that, that sounds very much like at least like that degree of criticism, saying that it's not the dictatorship of the proletariat, is very much the, well, actually, sorry, no, what I'm saying is wrong. Is that
This is more radical, actually, than the Trotskyist position, because he says it's not a proletarian dictatorship, or at least not as they are conceptualized by Marx and Lenin. So, never mind. But now let the account return to Uno himself and to his relation to Marxian theory. In the famous subchapter on the historical tendency of capitalist accumulation, within the chapter on original accumulation in Marx's Capital, Marx refers to the supposed necessity of the transformation from capitalism to socialism. Marx writes as follows, quote, "The capitalist mode of appropriation, which springs from the capitalist mode of production, produces capitalist private property. This is the first negation of individual private property, is founded on the labor of its proprietor. But capitalist production begets, with the inexorability of a natural process, its own negation. This is the negation of the negation. It does not reestablish private property, but it does indeed establish individual property on the basis of the achievements of the capitalist era, namely cooperation in the possession in common of the land and the means of production produced by labor itself." End quote. Marx. Uno felt compelled to take a position with regard to this point in Capital. His central thesis is as follows. Although Marx refers to a, quote, necessity of the transition from capitalism to socialism, quote, I do not believe that this necessity follows from the economic laws which Marx discusses in Capital of the motion of capitalist society, end quote. Uno. Uno continues by asserting that the, quote, pure theory of capitalism has to present the capitalist commodity economy, quote, as if it were a self-perpetuating entity in order to divulge the laws of its motion. It therefore seems to me quite impossible for economic theory to demonstrate at the same time a transformation which involves the denial of these laws, end quote. Uno. Neither a theory of, quote, pure capitalist society, nor a theory of various stages of capitalism, nor empirical studies of a concrete historical capitalist economy can provide an economic explanation of the process of transition to socialism, according to Uno. He states his core conception as follows, quote, in any case, whether or not the victory of socialism is necessary depends on the practice of socialist movements, not directly on the economic laws of motion of capitalist society, end quote. Uno. For Marxist-Leninist theorists in Japan who were oriented toward the Moscow orthodoxy, the opportunity thus presented itself to object to Uno's theory on the grounds that in the latter Marx's allusion to the necessity of the transition to socialism plays no positive role, but is rather problematized. Setsuo Furihata, himself one of the best-known members of the Uno school, reports that the influx of Marxist scientists into the Uno school increased under the impact of the loss of authority of the Japanese Communist Party as a result of the international events of 1956, and that somewhat later, quote, of the approximately 1,000 members of the Association of Marxist Economists in Japan, the Scientific Association for Economic Theory, Kazai Ryoran Gakai, circa 20% could be numbered among the Uno tendency, end quote. Furihata. Footnote. The dissemination of Marxism in the various Asian countries varied very widely in the 1960s, but nowhere else was there a comparable scientific intensity and theoretical depth of the discussion of Marx. In contrast to Japan, it is possible to refer to other Asian countries in which Marxist politics and theory have never exerted any significant influence. This applied and still applies to Turkey, for example, which can be described as a historical paradigmatic case in all matters relating to anti-Marxism. Yet even here, there were attempts to introduce Marxian theory, although these were largely unsuccessful. According to Jakob Demir, the first volume of Capital appeared in Turkish translation in full for the first time in 1966 to 67, 100 years after the first German edition. Demir relates that the book, quote, met with a silence laden with fear and fury on the part of reactionary Turkish journalists, end quote. In the early 1980s, Wolfgang Fritz Haug reported the torture and assassination of a Turkish publisher of Marx. There's a very interesting piece that kind of talks about the relationship of the Soviet Union, the relationship of the early Soviet Union or the early Bolshevik state to Ataturk's Turkey. Short-lived, I believe, I'm not exactly sure, but like a short-lived alliance between them, between the Bolshevik state and Turkey, the newly formed Turkish state out of the fall of the Ottoman Empire, which was out of the fall of the Ottoman Empire, which was while the new Ataturk state was repressing its left very brutally. There's a piece on that by Lauren Goldner. It's like reactionary anti-imperialism, or like socialism in one country before Stalin, or something like that, in Lauren Goldner's book. Very interesting. Where the hell am I? And footnote. New section. So this is section 2.3 of chapter 1. And it's titled, quote, Heretical Marxism in Eastern Europe. Just before we even get started, I have a number of books on this. I have a book called, what was the guy's name? Satterwhite, which was kind of about Marxist humanism just generally in the Eastern Bloc, so in Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, but also Yugoslavia. Obviously in Poland it would be like Kolakowski, for instance, but also Zygmunt Bauman and other people kind of like in that world. And then in Hungary there would be like the kind of like people that kind of came out of like a Lukashian interpretation of Marxism. So what's it like? Agnes Heller and what the hell is his name? Gregory Marcus. And then in like Czechoslovakia there'd be like Karol Kozik, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, amongst others. And then obviously the whole Praxis school, Mihailo Markovic, for instance, amongst others in Yugoslavia. But I also have a book by Gerson Escher, which is particularly just about Yugoslavia. So if you're interested in that, there's this before we even get started reading this section, if you're interested in that, there's plenty of things for you to sink your teeth into on the Free Association YouTube channel if you're interested. Anyway, one of the best-known, quote, heretical tendencies in Eastern European Marxism in the 1960s and 1970s was represented by a Yugoslav group of theorists around the journal Praxis, i.e. by thinkers such as Mihailo Markovic, Danko Grilic, Gajo Petrovic, and Predrag Vranički. This rather heterodox current stood, at least in part, for a, quote, theoretical humanism, unquote, especially oriented to the young Marx. Within the Yugoslav interpretation of Marx, a great deal of attention was paid to Marx's early work. In particular, the book, The Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts, first published in 1932, played a role in the Yugoslav discussion of the 1960s and 1970s around Marx's early writings. Hans-Georg Kahnert, who provides an exhaustive treatment of the Yugoslav discussion on Marxism in this period, states the following, quote, the unmistakably enthusiastic reception of the concept of alienation in the economic and philosophical manuscripts is in the first instance an expression of a corresponding need to catch up on the part of those Yugoslav philosophers who were not confronted with this aspect of Marxism during their studies in the USSR, in the early post-war years, or subsequently in Yugoslavia. He presumably had no access to the interpretations and discussions which followed the first publication of these manuscripts in 1932. End quote. Kahnert. Due to its focus on Marx's early works in particular and its emphasis of the alienation problematic, the approach of parts of the Yugoslav discussion were towards Marx's work The approach of parts of the Yugoslav discussion towards Marx's work is reminiscent of a general tendency in parts of the West European discussion of Marx in the post-war period. However, the fact that there was a significant turn towards Marx's early work within the Praxis Group does not mean that no attention was paid to Marx's Capital or to Marx's mature critique of political economy in general in the Yugoslav discussion of Marx. Although a translation of the Grundrisse was first published in Yugoslavia in 1979, one of the best-known representatives of the Praxis Group, the philosopher Gajo Petrović, had previously presented research into these manuscripts by Marx, which date from 1857 to 58. The work of the Praxis Group was widely received internationally. An international edition of the journal Praxis appeared intermittently in addition to the Yugoslav edition. From 1963 to 1974, an international summer school initiated by the Praxis Group was held on the Croatian island of Korčula in the Adriatic. Among other purposes, this served to facilitate intellectual exchange between Yugoslav and foreign thinkers. However, the representatives of the Praxis Group were criticized by the official Yugoslav party orthodoxy and were ultimately confronted by state repression. The Praxis Journal was discontinued in 1975. A further heretical orientation within Eastern European Marxism was the so-called Budapest School, i.e. the circle around Georg Lukács, who lived from 1885 to 1971. Lukács succeeded in gathering a circle of theorists around him, among whose most prominent members figured the philosopher Georg Marcus and Agnes Heller. Marx's early work played an important role in Marcus's philosophical reading of Marx, as it did in the discussion of the Yugoslav Praxis Group. A core aspect of Marcus's thought consisted in bringing Marxism and anthropology into relation with each other. After Lukács's death, Heller would follow a trajectory from protagonist of a critical Marxism to resolute opponent of Marxist thought. Footnote. Yet Lukács stated the following in an interview, quote, "Marcus is not a student of mine. Marcus returned from Moscow 75% a complete human being, and I'm not saying that I had no influence on him, but he cannot be described as my student," end quote. Lukács. End footnote. And that's the end of section 2 of chapter 1 of Marx Worldwide on the development of the international discourse on Marx since 1965 by Jan Hoff. Section 2 was titled Marxism's Resurgence Between the Inception and Highpoint of Political Movements of Emancipation, circa 1960/65 to 1977, with the headings Section 1, Heading 1, Western Europe and the Anglo-Saxon World, Heading 2, Latin America and Asia, and Heading 3, quote, Heretical Marxism in Eastern Europe. Thank you so much for listening. The next section, if you're listening along and I haven't recorded this video yet, is section 3 of chapter 1, which is titled From the Proclamation of the, quote, Crisis of Marxism to the Decline of Marxism as a Mass Ideology, circa 1974 to 1990. Thank you so much for listening.